ensure that you do have a balanced budget. I don't think it restricts the rights and the responsibilities of our elected officials, but rather allows greater level of strength in the American people's ability to affect change in Washington. Now, this has not been an easy process to this point, and I don't think it's going to be very easy for the next 6 months or so. And that is because there are very different ways of approaching this challenge that we have. There are many different groups within Congress who have many different approaches to take. But what I'm going to try to do, as I have done in the last 6 months, is listen to what people have to say in New Hampshire, consider all points of view, and believe me, there are varied points of view here in New Hampshire, and then make my best judgment on what is the best way to move forward. My hope is that we can get ourselves on a path to balancing our budget, to live within our means, to be fair and responsible to those who rely on services that the government provides, and ensure that this country, which I believe is the greatest country in the world, is never chastised by China or other competitors for the manner in which we operate. This will continue to be a difficult and challenging time in Washington, but I'm certainly up for it, and I will do my very best to represent you in a manner that is responsible, respectful of everyone in Washington, and to make sure that I do everything I can to try to calm the rhetoric and the tone, focus on results, focus on ensuring that people have the facts, because at the end of the day, this is your dollars. You deserve to know what the truth is about how your money is being spent. And you deserve to have good stewards of your dollars, which are your representatives in Congress. Hopefully, we can come to a point where we have reasonable people agreeing on the best and most effective way to come to agreements in the challenges that we have. So that being said, I'm sure that there are questions or comments. I'd like to open it up to as many as I possibly can. So, sir, why don't we start with you?
Thank you.
Sure.
On the Sunday talk show that you appeared on in the past with Josh McKelvin, Kelly Ayotte, Senator Ayotte, appeared this past Sunday and presented a case for why she did not vote for the deal. And it's something that has not been made very much of, and I haven't heard you refer to it either. And that is that the Congressional Budget Office automatically assumes a 7.5% to 8% increase in spending every year. And so the cuts that have been agreed to have been against the backdrop of a presumed 7.5% to 8% increase, which is sort of analogous to me and my family saying, okay, I'm going to get a raise of 7.5%. How much of that will be spent? But then I don't get the raise. So I go further and deeper into debt. I think Senator Ayotte's vote was the correct vote, and wish that many more had taken that approach, because the reality is that it's a case of most people are unaware of the fact that these cuts are only as they apply to the automatically presumed increases in spending. So in spite of the fact that there were cuts made, the reality is that it's still going to add to our deficit over the entire term.
Well, let me clarify one position you made. CBO, you were correct in your analysis that what CBO said, that the spending levels are going to rise for the overall budget of the country. That is because we have divided, Washington has divided the budget into two categories, discretionary and mandatory. Discretionary, again, is all the agency work, all the agency work. That is what I refer to as our operating budget. The other component is mandatory. Mandatory spending is on autopilot. It can only be changed by an act of Congress and signed into law by the President. So right now, Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security, which is the entitlement component, is growing at a rate faster than the cuts on the discretionary side. There are real cuts in discretionary, and here is the one misnomer. We cap spending on discretionary in this piece of legislation It is actually cut from last year's number. Next year's number is actually cut from this year's number. And it's going to be capped for the next 10 years. So you are going to see, on average, an 11% reduction on spending on the discretionary side within the different agencies. There still is spending growth on the mandatory side. That is absolutely accurate. Because that is growing at 8% a year. We're cutting, about 11% on the discretionary side. Discretionary is only about 37% of the budget, and the other is about 64% of the budget. You see an overall spending increase next year at that rough number of 7%. So if we want to reduce long-term spending, and if we want to address the structural deficit we have, you cannot ignore the mandatory side. And so far, that has been ignored in past Congress as well as this Congress. So that is the fundamental issue here. And if you remember, I'm sure there'll be a lot of feelings about this, and discussion about it, and opinions about it. But when the House passed its budget, it took on some entitlement reform, not all. It didn't touch Social Security, but it dealt with Medicaid and Medicare. And about
I gotta get out of here.
That was passed.
You ain't answering.
We saw commercials where a gentleman who looked like Paul Ryan was pushing an elderly woman off a cliff in a wheelchair. We are trying to reform responsibly and modify the future costs of Medicare and Medicaid. We did it in this budget and it passed. The Senate has not taken it up yet. There are differences of opinion in the House and the Senate how to address this issue. But if we can get tax reform, the only two big pieces really left are tax reform and entitlements. If we can get those two components addressed, you will see the trajectory of spending decline over the next 10 years. That really is the battle in Washington right now. And there are two very different approaches on how to solve that problem.
Well, I'd just like to follow up with one
Sure.
part of that,
Sure.
and that has to do with the entitlements. The reality is that the Republican Party has not done a very good job. Most people's knowledge of what the Ryan Plan consists of come from a 2-minute segment of one of the major networks' news, or the photograph or the depiction of Granny being thrown over the cliff. I've read the Ryan Plan, and I think that any senior that would take the time to read it as opposed to taking their information from that would simply buy into the Ryan Plan, because it's a lot less expensive and a lot less destructive than what President Obama has planned.
Well, I will concede this point. There's 2 points I would concede. The proposal in the Ryan Plan proposed solutions before the problem was identified. People in Washington knew what the problem was, but nobody in Washington communicated what the problem was to the country. That was a problem. I mean, if I had started out the conversation on Medicare, giving you 3 facts, not my facts, not Republican facts, not Democrat facts, but facts from the trustees of Medicare. And the 3 facts are these: 10,000 new people coming on Medicare per day. 10,000, which means it's going to double in 10 years. Secondly, more and more physicians are refusing Medicare patients because the reimbursement rate is too low. That's fact number 2. And the third fact, this is again according to the Medicare trustees, if nothing is done, Medicare goes bankrupt in less than a decade. It's not less than 50 years, less than a decade. I'm 40. If nothing is done by the time I'm 52, it's bankrupt, which means anyone on Medicare now, anyone who wants to get on Medicare, would have nothing in 12 years. So if we started the conversation by pointing to a nonpartisan report that said Congress needs to fix this problem, we communicated that for 2 months to the country, and they then underappreciated the severity of this challenge. Then we said, in the Budget Committee, we're going to try to start working on this challenge. The first idea may not be the solution, but it's an idea. Is it worth considering? I think most people would say yes. Should it be modified? Maybe people would say yes. But that's my point about what I said earlier, that there has to be a fundamental shift from the partisanship that we see and a greater level of focus on facts and solutions and results. And if we can get enough people in Washington to do that, then I would agree with you. I think most people would say, Frank, solve the problem for me. I'd like to see Medicare preserved. I'd like to make sure that I receive it and my kids receive it. So there is, and I learned that lesson that we didn't identify what the problem is. So I have spent a lot of time now at least talking with people about what the problem is and why a solution is necessary. I think you had your hand up, and then I'll go to you after this one.
Well, I have a commentary.
Sure.
I think that if you look at what happened in the market after the vote, that was a pretty clear indication as to how the financial market looked at what you did. And in Friday, $7 trillion of investors' value had vanished. Today, we're down another 400 points. And the view of the market is that this economy is going into stall speed. If we don't have at least 2% growth, minimum 2% growth, this is like a 747. It loses airspeed, it's going to crash. And so what you all have done is you put us into almost to the stall speed, and we're about ready to crash. And we're in a desperate situation at this point. And talking about what's going to happen in 10 years is not what's going to happen next week, next month, and so forth. I mean, we're in a near crash situation, and we have millions of people who are out of work, don't have jobs. The economy is not going to grow the way it's going because there's no money in the economy to do it. And I think the whole idea of a balanced budget is the craziest thing I've ever heard of, because the one thing the economy needs for a nation, this is not a personal economy, the government has got to be able to be the investor of last resort that keeps the economy going. And if you create that situation, you have exactly the reverse of that situation. The government has to fire people and put them on. 70% of the economy is consumer spending. And the more consumers you have out of work, the worse it's going to get. So I think that it has been a disaster what you have done and what you're continuing to do. And I think that, as I say, the balanced budget is absolutely contrary to what the great majority of economists think needs to be done.
Well, I'm glad you brought up growth, because Friday, the President, the White House announced revised GDP numbers, gross domestic product numbers, from Q1, first 3 months of the quarter. Most people probably still aren't aware of what those numbers are. It was revised from 0.19% growth, almost at what you said, the 2% minimum necessary, down to 0.4. That is atrocious. Number two, second quarter numbers were released, and they were 1.3% growth. Now, if we are going to grow ourselves out of this economy, and I agree that we need to grow ourselves out, which means the 14 million people who are out of work, get at least half of them back to work. That in and of itself brings dollars into the treasury. That increases revenues. It also cuts